Hello and welcome to week 44 of this 52-week series for the Web Pro on what every web administrator needs to know to be successful in this space. My name is Scott Forsyth, and today I'm starting a mini 4-part series on IIS FTP. IIS FTP is an impressive application and offers a lot of control. However, at first glance it doesn't appear that way because of its unique method of working by convention. In particular, what is not immediately obvious is how to redirect users into particular folders when you want more than one user per site and you want the users to manage different folders. So understanding IIS FTP's nuances will help you become a web pro. So today I'm going to move through the basics. Next week on IIS manager users for FTP, the third week on user isolation, and the final week I'm going to be covering firewall settings and troubleshooting. In terms of the install of IIS FTP, there's actually two different ways to do it. So if you're in Windows Server 2008, this is pre-R2, or basically it's also called IIS 7, what you want to use is the out-of-band FTP, otherwise you're using the old one. And you can do that by navigating to iis.net, and go to iis.net, and search for FTP, and I believe it's right at the top. And it is. Download FTP service for IIS 7.0. That's what you want in that case. And it's called FTP 7.5 is the one you want. It's downloaded out of bound. If you are on 2008 R2 or IIS 7.5, then what you can do is you can do this through Server Manager. And so I'll do that one. I'll show you this how to do this here. And you go to your roles, you jump into your web server role, and go into Add Role Service, and you're going to make sure that your FTP is installed. And really the service and extensibility are both fine to do, but you could just do the core without the extensibility if you wanted to. And that gives you the install for IIS FTP. Now there's a couple other things. Next week, for example, I'm going to be covering the IIS Manager users, and if you do that, you want to also have the management service here installed. And I'll mention this again briefly next week. So those are the key things to install. And once you do that, you're set. IIS is now a core part. It's enabled, basically. So let's take a look. If we look here on existing server here I've been working with for a few months, and we're going to go to acme.com. If we check our bindings, notice we don't have anything for FTP yet. And so to add this, you can click on the Add FTP Publishing here. And so we're going to go, and the IP, we can leave it all unassigned, or let's just use the internal IP of this server. And we're not going to use the host headers. We're going to talk about that later on. So you can use allow SSL if you want to allow the end user to have the choice, or require SSL if you want to ensure that they always use SSL when they're connecting. And I'm just going to specify the one here, the local self-sign cert on the server, but you can put a real certificate here, and there's less prompting if you do so. And so we're going to go, and again, by default, neither of these are checked. I'm going to check basic. It is possible to use anonymous authentication. Be very, very certain you're not using anonymous for uploading, for write. If you do so, they're going to get a lot of whereas, and hackers are going to find it soon enough and upload all their junk there. You can use anonymous for read. Some people do that. But for the most part, at least in where I hang out, I'm using basic authentication. That's with the username and password. And so we're going to say allow access to, for right now, let's just say we're going to allow access to my Scott user. And we're going to give me read and write access and hit finish. It says it's added. You must refresh the home page for the changes to be recognized. And so now if I hit the F5 key, then you see that it refreshes it here. And I could have right-clicked and hit refresh too. Same thing. And so now we have this new FTP region, which has various parts here. So let's do a quick walkthrough. Actually, before I do that, let's go to the other machine here, and I have FileZilla installed. FileZilla is an excellent FTP client. There are many that you can choose from. What's nice, it's completely free, it's open source, it's always being added to, and it's very straightforward, and it supports all the protocols we want. So it's excellent for this demo. Feel free to use what you prefer, though. And so in this case, we're going to say, how about the Web Pro Series connection? And our host then is going to be, well, if I go to the other machine, and it is 10.245.22, and of course you can use a DNS name if you have it set up as well. Now in terms of protocol, notice we have FTP, and then we also have what's called SFTP, and that's different than FTPS. So SFTP is using SSH, and IIS does not support that. And my understanding of the reason is it has to do with SSH is not owned by Microsoft. There's certain legal or security rights to using that. What they do have, though, is FTP over SSL or TLS. And so if we do this require explicit FTP over TLS, we can use that. And in fact, if you use plain FTP, your username and password is sent in completely plain text. Anyone sniffing the wire can see your password itself, just as plain as day. And so that's a big vulnerability of FTP. It has been for many years. So any chance you have, use the SSL part. And so we're going to use normal, where we can actually enter in a username and password. Now I have to use an administrator password because I haven't set up, I'll show you later on how to do more. And so I'm using myself, who have granted access, and we'll connect. Because I'm using over SSL, it gives me the prompt, and it doesn't match, in this case, the IP that I connected with. It's this one here. So I'm going to say, yeah, I'm going to trust it. And I'm going to hit OK, and we're in. So we have a straightforward example. We set up FTP, and it works. And if all you're trying to do is connect to the root of the site, one user, and the user is an administrator on a machine, then it's almost as straightforward. On the fourth week, I'm going to cover the firewalls in depth for the various different options that you have: passive, active, and standard FTP, and over SSL. So for right now, I have this set up and working, but understand that there may be more than what I just did. So back on the actual FTP server, let's take a look at some of these basic settings here just to understand. I'll cover some today and some in the other lessons. So right off we see the FTP authentication, and that is basically anonymous and basic, and there's a couple providers. In fact, this one isn't on by default. So basic and anonymous, and then the custom providers that are built in as of now are IIS Manager Auth, and I'll cover that next week, and ASP.NET Auth. And so those can be added. In this case, you can see I have basic auth enabled. And for the FTP authorization rules, we see the one that was added during the wizard. But you can add allow and deny rules. So for example, I can allow everyone in the administrators group or specified user. And so let's say I were to create a user called designer, give them read and write permissions, and now they're granted access at least past the FTP authorization. We also have current sessions is handy. You can see, in fact, if I go back here, let's reestablish a session. It has a short timeout, I believe it's 2 minutes still. And so now I've established that. I come back here and refresh, and you can see some really useful information about this session that's been established. And we can go further along here to the directory browsing. I'm going to cover some of these later on. The virtual directory is part of it, and the listing style is just the syntax, the way that you want it to appear. And we can also, the FTP firewall support, I'll cover that on our fourth week. And it is possible to add IP restrictions. You can add allow or deny rules by IP or range of IPs, and essentially locking down your FTP even further from any types of hacks. And the logging itself, you can specify the folder. Notice here you can add certain things. So some that are useful to add would be bytes sent, bytes received, time taken is fairly useful. And those are probably the main ones that you'd want to add. And you can hit OK if you want. And notice there's a couple things here when the logs roll over and stuff like this. This is very similar to HTTP as well. You can turn it off if you want to, but I don't recommend on FTP that you turn off. This is if there is an exploit, a hacker gets in, it's often enough it's through FTP, and you want to be able to dig through this. And so I'll save that. And also the FTP messages, you have the option of being able to specify the messages that are seen by FTP clients. You can put detailed, please, it's illegal to log into our server without permission kind of idea. And we also have request filtering. There is some more advanced file, different types of filtering based by file, based by the certain parts can be hidden within FTP. So for example, your FTP, your front page extensions, your _VTI bin, that can be hidden, and you can add any more of these that you want. Certain URL sequences you can hide, and also certain particular commands that are commonly used with the FTP protocol can be allowed or denied as well. And there's some more advanced settings here if you want to dig into them. It's not too often you have to change this, but understand that they're there if you need to. The FTP SSL settings, are here, and notice this is what was set up during the wizard. I use the SSL cert here and set to allow. If you use the use 128-bit encryption, it's just going to ensure that it's 128, I assume, or greater encryption, and it won't revert back to the 40-bit or any of the previous older ones. But we'll leave this here. It's fine. And finally is the user isolation. I'm going to cover this in depth on the 3rd week because there's a lot of discussion around this. This is where IIS FTP really shines, but it also just takes a little bit of a learning curve. It's not intuitive necessarily. What I've done here is by default, it uses the FTP root directory, which means when someone logs in, they're dropped into the root folder, which is going to be right here in this case. So we're going to cover the FTP isolation in depth. And then the one other thing to keep in mind is your bindings. Notice that I'm binding here to not a host name over port 21, and I have the IP address binding. In terms of security, IIS FTP actually can be fairly difficult to understand certain parts. So what I'm going to do is today I'm going to show you FTP security as it relates to what I just covered here today. So in the next couple weeks I'm also going to be talking more about other security things to consider with the IIS Manager users and with the different isolation users. But for now we're going to assume a Windows account. And so for acme.com, if I go and actually let's create a new user from scratch, and we'll take a look at what this is going to look like. So go to Computer Management and Local Users and Groups. You can use an Active Directory user too. And let's just call it FTP user. And so we're going to give it a password. And we're going to set it to never expires. So I've created that, and I have not granted them any extra permissions whatsoever. So they're not an administrator or anything else, just a standard member of users. And so what we're going to do is we do need to grant them FTP authorization. And so we're going to go in here, we'll add an allow rule for a specific user. It's going to be FTP user, and we're going to grant them read and write. But what we also need to do, in fact, let's go and watch it fail. So if we go and we connect, and let's just change this to using our FTP user, and we use our FTP user here for the password, and connect, and notice we get critical error, could not connect to the server. And I'll show actually in the 4th week how to do more troubleshooting, but in this case we really just know user cannot log in, home directory is inaccessible. So let's go back and assign the necessary permissions. So if we go to our FTP site, acme.com, and we're going to go to edit permissions, and security, we'll do edit and add, and we're going to add this FTP user. And notice it's a local user, not an Active Directory user. If you're on a domain, you may need to change your location to the local machine, or a domain vice versa. And so we're going to give them modify is what you probably want if you want them to be able to create folders in that too. We'll hit OK and OK. We'll go in here and connect to that user, and notice now we do have access. And if we were to do a test of whatever type, and we'll get our default .aspx works here. If we were to edit this, and we're going to say test, and I don't want it to change automatically, but you could have set that. And then I'm going to drag this back over, and we're going to overwrite it. And you can see the file stamp has now changed if I were to refresh to today's date. So we've uploaded it. We have download and upload access to our new FTP account. This gives you the foundation of IIS. Next 3 weeks I'm going to cover it in a lot more depth. So next week I'm going to cover IIS Manager and how to use particular IIS Manager users. Let me show you here what they are. And IIS Manager permissions, we can create different users here and use them rather than having to use a Windows local user or an Active Directory user. And so it allows us to maintain everything on the machine here this way. The following week, I'm going to be covering the user isolation, and then the week after that, I'm going to be covering firewall and troubleshooting, the two of those together in the 1 week. So thanks for tuning in, and hope to see you again next week for more on FTP.